The night Emma Blackwell arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the bitter autumn of 1879, she had exactly 11 cents in her coat pocket, a carpet bag with a broken latch, and the kind of stubborn pride that had kept her alive through things most people could not survive. She had not planned to stop in Caldwell. She had not planned much of anything since leaving St. Louis 3 weeks prior, climbing into a stagecoach with her jaw set and her eyes forward, telling herself that whatever lay ahead had to be better than what she had left behind. The coach had broken an axle 2 miles outside of town. The driver had cursed a blue streak that would have made a sailor blush, and Emma had simply gathered her bag, stepped down from the tilted coach with quiet dignity, and walked the rest of the way into town on her own 2 feet. Caldwell was a cattle town, rough at the edges and loud at its center, smelling of livestock and sawdust, and the particular kind of ambition that settled in places where men came to make fortunes or lose everything trying. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other with room to spare, and the buildings on either side looked like they had grown up overnight without any particular plan. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with piano music already pouring out into the late afternoon air, a land office, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a boarding house with a hand-painted sign out front that read Mrs. Calloway's rooms, clean beds, reasonable rates. Emma walked directly to the boarding house because it was the most practical option available to her, and Emma Blackwell was, above all other things, a practical woman. She was 26 years old, with dark brown hair that she kept pinned beneath a hat that had seen better days, and gray eyes the color of a winter sky just before it decided what kind of storm to produce. She was not fragile-looking, but she had the lean, careful appearance of someone who had been rationing things, food, hope, trust, for a considerable length of time. Mrs. Calloway turned out to be a stout woman in her 50s with flour on her apron and a measuring look that swept over Emma in about 3 seconds and apparently decided she was acceptable, because she quoted a weekly rate and showed her to a room on the 2nd floor without much ceremony. The room was small but clean. A brass bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the back alley, and beyond that the open prairie stretching toward a horizon that seemed impossibly far away. Emma set her bag down on the bed, sat beside it, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of feeling completely lost before she straightened her spine, smoothed her skirt, and began making a plan. She had skills. She could sew, having spent 4 years working in a seamstress shop in St. Louis before that particular chapter of her life had closed in a way she did not like to think about. She could cook well enough. She could read and write and do sums faster than most people she had ever met, which had occasionally caused problems in a world that did not always know what to do with a woman who was quicker at arithmetic than the men around her. She had a small amount of money remaining, enough for perhaps 2 weeks at the boarding house, and she needed employment before that window closed. The next morning she went to the general store and spoke to the owner, a man named Harold Birch, who told her he already had his wife helping him and did not need anyone else. She tried the land office, where the clerk looked at her as though she had suggested something indecent. She left 3 notes with Mrs. Calloway for families who might need a seamstress, and she went to the church and spoke with the Reverend, who was sympathetic but had nothing to offer in the way of paying work. By the end of that first week, she had taken in 2 small mending jobs from Mrs. Calloway's other boarders, which paid her barely enough to cover 1 night's room. She was eating sparingly, stretching what little she had, going to bed some nights with her stomach complaining and her pride refusing to let her show it. That was how things stood on the 13th day of October, 1879, when she came upstairs from supper, a thin bowl of soup and a heel of bread, all she had allowed herself, and found something outside her door. It was a tin plate, covered with a clean cloth. She stood in the hallway for a moment, completely still, looking at it. Then she crouched down and lifted the cloth. Stew, rich, fragrant, with actual chunks of beef and potato and carrot, steam still rising from the surface in delicate curls. Beside the plate was a thick slice of cornbread and a small jar of what appeared to be honey. Everything arranged with a care that seemed almost deliberate, almost gentle. Emma looked up and down the hallway. It was empty. She could hear Mrs. Calloway moving around downstairs, and the faint sound of one of the other boarders, a traveling salesman named Mr. Pierce, coughing behind his door at the end of the hall. She picked up the plate, brought it inside her room, and sat on the edge of her bed trying to figure out who had left it there and why. She could not determine either answer, but she was hungry enough that the not knowing eventually lost the argument with the wanting, and she ate every last bite of that stew, sopped the plate clean with the cornbread, and drizzled the honey over the remaining piece. It was the best meal she had eaten in 2 weeks. That fact made her feel equal parts grateful and uneasy. The next night, the same thing. A tin plate outside her door when she came upstairs after dark. This time it was roast chicken, golden and fragrant, with sweet potatoes and green beans cooked soft with a piece of salt pork. The cornbread again, golden and crumbling. A small cloth-wrapped piece of apple cake. She stood in the hallway longer this time, listening. She thought she heard the back stairs creak, but when she went to the window she could see nothing in the alley below but shadows and the distant orange glow of the saloon's lanterns. She ate the meal. She told herself she would figure it out. She also told herself that she would not allow herself to become dependent on mystery food from unknown persons, which was a position she found increasingly difficult to maintain as the days passed and the meals kept appearing. Because they did keep appearing. Each evening, without fail, when Emma came upstairs to her room, whether at 7 o'clock or 8 or once nearly 9, when she had been working late on an embroidery piece for Mrs. Calloway herself, there was a plate outside her door. Sometimes it was a cloth-covered tin plate. Sometimes it was a small pot with a lid. Once it was a careful arrangement wrapped in brown paper and tied with kitchen twine. The food was always hot, always substantial, always, and this was the part that got to her, the part she could not quite categorize thoughtful. Not just any food, but the right food. Hearty without being wasteful, warm without being lavish. Exactly what a person needed at the end of a hard, hungry day. Cornbread appeared with almost every meal, as though whoever was leaving the food had noticed that she always finished it first. She began to watch. She was careful about it, practical. She did not go storming up and down the hallways or make accusations to Mrs. Calloway, because she had no evidence and the last thing she needed was to make enemies in the only place in this town that was keeping a roof over her head. Instead, she simply paid attention. She noticed that the plate was never there when she arrived upstairs after supper with the other boarders, but was always there if she came up even 30 minutes later on her own. Which meant someone knew her routine well enough to time it. That observation should have frightened her more than it did. The truth was, it mostly made her curious. And if she was honest with herself in the private hours before sleep, it made something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest, something she did not quite have a name for yet and was not entirely certain she should encourage. Mrs. Calloway's other boarders at the time were Mr. Pierce the salesman, who had a bad cough and left within the first week, a young cowhand named Tommy who was saving up wages and was barely old enough to shave, and an older couple, the Hendersons, who were passing through on their way to Colorado. None of them seemed likely candidates. The Hendersons ate supper together every night and went to bed early. Tommy was sweet but slightly bewildered by the world in general. Mr. Pierce was too preoccupied with being unwell to be cooking elaborate meals for strangers, which meant the food was coming from outside the boarding house itself. Someone was cooking somewhere, carrying the meal across town, and going up the back stairs of Mrs. Calloway's establishment specifically to leave it outside Emma's door. The thought was staggering, actually, when she laid it out plain like that. It required effort. Sustained, deliberate, repeated effort night after night. She wanted to know who. The wanting grew each day, precise and insistent, taking up space in her mind that she could not quite evict it from no matter how much practical thinking she tried to pile on top. Meanwhile, her situation in Caldwell was beginning to change, slowly, and in the way that things change in small towns through talk. Mrs. Calloway had apparently mentioned to someone that her new boarder did fine needlework, and that someone had mentioned it to someone else. And by the end of the second week, Emma had 3 new mending commissions and an inquiry from the wife of the local banker about whether she could alter a dress. She also had an unexpected conversation with Harold Birch at the general store, who had reconsidered and wondered if she might want to come in 3 mornings a week to help with the books, since it turned out his wife had no patience for figures and he had discovered that neither did he. Emma said yes to everything. She was not too proud for that. She was beginning to feel, tentatively and with great caution, as though Caldwell might actually be a place she could build something real. A small life, perhaps, but a genuine one, and every night the warm meal waited at her door. It was on the 14th evening, 2 weeks to the day since the first plate had appeared, that Emma came upstairs at 7:30 and found the meal there as she always did. Rabbit stew this time, with biscuits, a small jar of preserves, and what appeared to be a wedge of dried apple pie wrapped carefully in cloth. She stood in the hallway looking at it, and then she made a decision. She did not pick up the food. She left it where it was, went back to the staircase, and sat down 3 steps from the top in the dark, where she could see the door to her room without being immediately visible to anyone coming up the back stairs. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. She did not have to wait long, perhaps 10 minutes. She heard the creak of the back stairs, the same creak she had heard the very first night without knowing what it meant. And then she saw the hallway door at the far end open and close again, very quietly. For a moment she could not see anything clearly in the dim light of the single lantern that hung at the far end of the hall. Then her eyes adjusted and she saw him. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark canvas coat and a battered hat that he had clearly not thought to remove when coming indoors. He moved with the particular quiet of someone accustomed to not making noise, the kind of careful step that spoke of long hours outdoors in country where sound carried. He was heading toward her door, or rather, toward where her food sat, and he had not yet noticed her sitting in the shadow of the staircase. She watched him pause at her door. He stood there for a moment looking at the untouched plate, and even from her position she could see the slight tension that ran through him at finding it still there. He reached out and straightened the cloth slightly over the jar of preserves, a small unconscious gesture that she registered and did not forget. Then she spoke, quietly enough not to carry through the walls but clearly enough that there was no mistake. "I would like to know who you are." He went very still, the stillness of a man startled down to his foundation. Then he turned slowly and looked toward the staircase, and she stood up from the step and moved into the better light of the hallway. He was older than she had initially guessed, perhaps 30, 31, with a face that had been shaped by weather and work into something honest and good-looking without being flashy about it. Strong jaw, dark eyes, a week or more of stubble that had not quite decided if it was a beard. He held his hat in his hands now, had taken it off at some point while she was thinking her thoughts about his face, and he was looking at her with an expression that she found she could not immediately categorize. It was not guilt exactly. It was not quite embarrassment. It was something more complicated than either, something that had fear and steadiness mixed into it in equal parts. He said, "My name is Jeremiah Watkins, ma'am. I apologize if I startled you." His voice was low and careful, and he had a slight drawl to it that placed him somewhere south of here, Texas, she thought, or maybe Indian Territory. Emma folded her arms across her chest. "Mr. Watkins, you have been leaving food outside my door for 2 weeks." It was not a question. He did not treat it like one. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" A long pause. He seemed to be choosing his words with the same deliberateness that someone might use choosing a path across uncertain ground. "I work for Mr. Birch at the general store, loading and unloading stock, keeping inventory of the back. I was there the morning after you arrived in town and I heard you asking him for work. He paused again. And I saw your face when he said no. Emma held herself very still. What about my face? Nothing that you should be ashamed of, he said, and there was a quiet firmness in it that she noticed. You kept your chin up the whole time, but I could see that things were hard. I have a room above the livery stable. The man who keeps it lets me use the stove in exchange for helping with the horses. I cook most nights anyway. It did not seem like a great effort to cook a little more. She stared at him. You cooked for me every night for 2 weeks because you saw my face when Harold Birch turned me down. He met her eyes without flinching. Yes, ma'am. You don't know me. No, he agreed. I don't. There was a silence in the hallway that lasted long enough for them both to be very aware of it. Emma was trying to find the practical, sensible response to this situation, the one that thanked him politely, drew a firm line, and sent him on his way. She was composing it in her head even as she looked at him. But the thing she kept running up against was the reality of those 14 meals, each one warm and thoughtful, and asking absolutely nothing of her. 14 evenings she had gone to bed not hungry, which in her current circumstances was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the difference between keeping the strength to face the next day and not. Mr. Watkins, she said finally, I am obliged to you, genuinely, but I am not a charity case. I know that, he said, and he said it immediately, without any of the hesitation that would have meant he was just being polite. Any woman who walks 2 miles with a broken bag after a coach axle gives out and then goes looking for work the next morning before the sun is properly up is not a charity case. That's just someone having a hard time of it, which can happen to anyone. She had not known he knew about the coach, or about her walking into town, or about the next morning. She had the strange sensation of realizing she had been seen far more clearly than she had imagined, and by someone she had not even known was looking. You have been watching me, she said. Noticing, he said. Not watching, there is a difference. She was not entirely sure she agreed with that distinction, but she found that the word he had chosen, noticing, sat differently in her than she would have expected. It felt less like surveillance and more like something else, something she was not going to name yet. I am going to be employed, she told him, because practicality was her oldest comfort. Mr. Birch has asked me to help with the books. I have mending work. I will be fine. I'm glad to hear it, he said, and he meant it. She could tell. There was not a trace of condescension in it. Another silence. He was still holding his hat. She noticed his hands broad, calloused, steady. Working hands. I will not be needing the meals any longer, she said, and then felt compelled, against her better judgment, to add, but I would like to know more about the person who left them, if you have any interest in talking. Something changed in his expression then, something that moved through his dark eyes like light through water. I believe I have considerable interest in that, ma'am, he said. Emma, she said, Mrs. Calloway has a parlor. It is empty most evenings after 7. If you wanted to come by sometime and talk like civilized people, I would not object to that. He nodded once carefully, as though the gesture required precision. Tomorrow evening, he said. If that suits. It suits, Emma said. She picked up her plate and went inside her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and ate the rabbit stew, which was still warm, and she stared at the wall and tried to figure out exactly what she thought about Jeremiah Watkins. She discovered that she could not quite decide, and that discovering something she could not immediately decide was, for Emma Blackwell, very nearly unprecedented. He came to the parlor the next evening at 7 o'clock exactly, which told her something about him right away. He had cleaned up, the stubble was neatly trimmed, his shirt was clean, and he was without his hat, which gave her a proper look at his face. He had dark hair with a slight wave to it, and those eyes that she had only seen in the dim hallway light were, she found in the parlor lamp, a dark warm brown with flecks of amber in them. He sat in the chair across from hers with his forearms on his knees, and he looked at her directly, which she appreciated. Mrs. Calloway appeared briefly in the doorway, assessed the situation with her efficient measuring gaze, and then, slightly to Emma's surprise, retreated to the kitchen without comment. which was either a sign of extraordinary good manners on her landlady's part, or a sign that she already knew Jeremiah Watkins and had some opinion about him. Emma decided to begin the way she always began things, directly. "Where are you from, Mr. Watkins?" "Texas, originally," he said. "Hill country outside of Fredericksburg. My father's family has been there since before I was born. My mother's people are from further south near the border." He paused. "I have been moving around for the past few years. I came up with a cattle drive 2 years ago and decided to stay when the drive ended." "Why Caldwell?" He considered that. "It needed staying in," he said, which was not the answer she expected. "A lot of places you ride through and you can see they are going to be fine one way or another. Caldwell has good bones, but it needs people willing to put down roots. I thought I might be one of them." Emma found that answer more interesting than almost anything else he could have said. "And have you been putting down roots?" "Working on it," he said. "It takes time." She asked about his work, and he told her about the job at the general store loading wagons, managing stock, the kind of work that required a strong back and attention to detail, and about the arrangement at the livery stable, and about the fact that he had, over the past year, been saving what he could toward a small piece of land east of town that a man named Cooper was willing to sell in parcels. She asked if he had family, and his expression shifted in a way she recognized, the particular tightening of someone navigating around a grief they had learned to carry but had not put down. He told her that his father had passed 4 years ago, and his mother the year after, and that he had a younger sister who had married a rancher near San Antonio and was doing well from what her letters said. "You're alone, then," Emma said, not unkindly, just precisely. "I am," he said. "And yourself?" It was a fair question, since she had asked him the same. She told him about St. Louis. Not all of it, not yet, but the shapes of it. She had grown up in a boarding house, not entirely unlike this one, her mother taking in laundry and mending after her father had died of fever when Emma was 9. She had learned to sew from necessity before she had learned it as a trade. She had worked at the seamstress shop for 4 years, and then there had been a man. She said it simply, without particular emphasis, but she watched his eyes when she said it and saw them go very careful and still. A man who had not been what he presented himself to be, and who had left her in circumstances that required her to make a change quickly and without much preparation. She did not say more than that. He did not ask more than that. But he looked at her steadily the whole time she spoke, and when she finished he said, "That took courage, making a start in a new place on your own." "It took necessity," she said. "Courage might be giving it more credit than it deserves." "The two are not mutually exclusive," he said. She looked at him across the parlor table and felt something shift in the room, some quality of the air between them that was different from what it had been when he sat down, not unpleasant, not alarming. Something that had the texture of possibility. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "that I am not in the market for anything sentimental at the moment. I am building a life and I need to be practical about it." He did not smile exactly, but something in his expression softened around the edges. "I understand that completely," he said. "I am not looking to complicate your life, Emma. I would like to be your friend if that is something you would be open to." She studied him. "Why?" "Because you interest me," he said, without any artifice. "Because I have been noticing you for 2 weeks, and everything I have observed suggests you are someone worth knowing. And because Caldwell is a better place than it was 3 weeks ago, and I think you are part of the reason for that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I think I could manage a friendship, Mr. Watkins." "Jeremiah," he said, "if we're managing a friendship." "Jeremiah," she said, testing the name. It suited him, solid and a little old-fashioned. It did not try to be anything it was not. They talked for another hour until Mrs. Calloway could be heard closing up the kitchen and the parlor lamp began to burn low. He stood when Emma rose, and he walked to the door and put his hat on, and she thought for a moment of what he must have looked like all those evenings, carrying a covered plate up the back stairs of the boarding house in the dark, doing it quietly and completely without expectation of thanks or recognition or anything at all. She almost said something about it. Instead she said, "Good night, Jeremiah." "Good night, Emma," he said. "I'm glad you finally asked." She was still thinking about that when she fell asleep. The friendship proceeded as most real friendships do, without great ceremony, and with considerable authenticity. Jeremiah came to the parlor on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and on Sundays after church, he would sometimes appear with 2 cups of coffee from the small cookshop on Main Street, and they would sit on the porch of the boarding house if the weather allowed and talk about whatever came to hand. He was, she discovered, a man of uncommon range. He had read widely, more than she would have expected from someone who spent his days shifting crates at a general store, and he had opinions about things that he was willing to argue for and equally willing to abandon if she gave him a reason good enough. He had a dry sense of humor that crept up on her sideways, the kind that required you to be paying attention or you would miss it entirely. He knew a great deal about the land, the grass, the weather, the habits of animals, the way the prairie changed through the seasons, and he talked about it with a specific passion that she found, unexpectedly, moving. He also told her things about Caldwell that she had not been in a position to learn on her own. He told her which of the townsfolk were generous and which were small-minded. He told her about the complicated politics of the cattle trade and about the relationships between the ranchers and the homesteaders moving in from the east, and about the tension that ran through the whole territory because of the railroad and who would and would not benefit from where it went. He told her about the communities of freedmen who had come west after the war and what they faced trying to build lives in a territory that offered freedom on paper but not always in practice. He told her about the Apache bands further south and west, and about the injustices that continued to be visited upon them, lands taken, promises broken, people displaced and treated as obstacles to a civilization that had very little interest in what they thought about the matter. He spoke about this with a directness that surprised her, without the usual dismissive language she heard from most men, and she asked him why he thought about it the way he did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother had Apache blood. Not much, a generation back, and she never spoke of it openly because there was no safety in it. But she knew what it meant to be looked through by the people around her. I suppose some of that stayed with me." Emma understood, in her own different way, what it meant to be looked through. She thought that might be one of the reasons they talked as easily as they did, not because their experiences were the same, but because they had each, in their own way, learned what it felt like to be considered less than what they were. She was working steadily now. The work at the general store, 3 mornings a week, had turned into 5 mornings a week, as Mr. Birch discovered that having someone who could actually read a ledger was transforming his accounts from a mess into something he could plan around. The mending work had grown through word of mouth into something approaching a proper seamstress trade. She had taken on 2 major dress commissions and was in the process of negotiating with the wife of the land office clerk for a monthly retainer to do alterations and repairs for her household. She had begun putting a little aside each week, more than covering her room and board, with enough left over to think, very tentatively, about what else might be possible. One Thursday in November, Jeremiah arrived at the boarding house parlor looking more animated than she usually saw him, and when he sat down he unrolled a piece of paper on the small table between them. It was a plot map, a section of land east of town, divided into parcels by hand-drawn lines. He pointed to one of the parcels, 30 acres, more or less square, with a creek running along the south edge. "Cooper's agreed to terms," he said. "I can take this parcel at the end of the year." 30 acres and the rights to the creek access. Emma looked at the map. "That is wonderful," she said, and meant it. She could see from his face what it meant to him. "What will you do with it?" "Start small," he said. "Build a house, nothing grand, a sensible place. Put up a barn, get a few head of cattle to start. The soil along that creek is good enough for a kitchen garden, and I want to keep horses. I have always done better with horses than I have with cattle." He paused, looking at the map with an expression of careful, contained wanting. "It's not much yet, but it's a start." "It is everything," Emma said, because it was. She understood that particular feeling, the specific power of having a patch of ground you could call your own when you had spent time having nothing. You should be proud. He looked up from the map and at her, and for a moment the expression on his face was not one she had seen there before. It was open in a way that was slightly different from his usual directness, more unguarded, as though the map and the news and her saying it meant something everything had combined to lower some guard he usually kept in place. "Come and see it," he said. "When the weather is decent, I would like you to see it." "I would like that," she said. They went out on a Saturday in late November when the sky was pale blue and clean and cold, and they rode out in the wagon he had borrowed from the livery stable. It was the first time she had ridden beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his arm beside hers as the wagon moved, and she was very aware of that proximity in a way that she noted and then set carefully aside. The land was beautiful in a way she had not expected. She had grown up in a city and had not yet fully adjusted her eye to the prairie, had not yet learned to read its subtlety. But riding across those 30 acres, with the frost still on the brown grass and the creek running clear and cold along the south edge, and the sky going forever in every direction, she understood something she had not before. She understood why he had stayed when the drive ended. She understood what he had meant when he said the land needed staying in. "I want to put the house here," he said, stopping the wagon at a slight rise in the middle of the property. "High enough to see the water from the porch, low enough that the hill behind will break the worst of the north wind." She stood beside him on the rise and looked at where the house would be, and she could see it quite clearly, the way you could sometimes see a thing that did not exist yet but was going to. The house and the barn and the kitchen garden along the creek and the horses in the flat beyond. "It's going to be something," she said. "It already is," he said, and there was a quality to his voice in that moment that made her turn and look at him. He was looking at her, not at the land, just briefly but long enough. She looked back at the creek. Her heart was doing something she had not asked it to do, something she was not yet ready to examine closely. They drove back to town in the late afternoon with the sky going orange and purple behind them, and he helped her down from the wagon with a steadiness that she had come to associate specifically with him. Not showy, not overly careful, just completely reliable, and she thanked him for the day and went inside. She sat in her room in the last of the light and let herself think about it honestly, the way she had been learning to think about things honestly since she had come to Caldwell. She thought about the 14 meals and the dark hallway and his face when she had finally spoken to him. She thought about the parlor conversations and the way he argued, and the way he listened, and the way he had said she was someone worth knowing with so little ceremony and so much sincerity that she had almost not known what to do with it. She thought about the land and the house that was not built yet, and the way he had looked at her on the rise. She acknowledged to herself with the full weight of her practical nature, in very serious danger of falling in love with Jeremiah Watkins, and she was not sure whether to run from that or toward it. She was still thinking about it when December came in cold and sharp, with a week of hard wind that kept most people inside and turned the streets of Caldwell into a gray, dusty tunnel. Jeremiah still came on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and on Sunday they could not sit on the porch, but they sat in the parlor and Mrs. Calloway brought them coffee without being asked, which Emma took as a sign of something. One evening in early December she asked him a question she had been turning over for some time. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if I had not come to Caldwell?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it the other way," he said. "I think about you not coming here, and I find I don't like thinking about it." "Why not?" He looked at the table between them at his hands. "Because the past few months have been the best I can recall in a long time," he said. "And the reason for that is sitting across from me." Emma felt the warmth of that move through her from the inside out. She took a breath. "Jeremiah." "Yes." "I told you at the beginning that I was not in the market for anything sentimental." "You did," he said. "I think my circumstances may have changed." He looked up at that. Those amber-flecked brown eyes, very steady, very warm. "Emma, I have been trying to be practical," she said. "It is what I am. It is what has kept me upright through a number of things I might not have survived otherwise. But I think there is a difference between being practical and being afraid, and I have been confusing the two, and I would like to stop." He was very still. "What are you telling me?" "I am telling you," she said, her voice steady but her hands clasped very tightly in her lap, "that I have great regard for you, more than I intended when we started talking in this parlor, and that I would like to know if you feel similarly, because if you do not I would rather know now, and if you do I think we should talk about what that means for both of us." He stood up from his chair. She stood up too, because it seemed necessary. They were standing on either side of the small parlor table, which was not very large, and when he came around the side of it, he was close enough that she could see everything in his face without having to look for it. "I fell in love with you somewhere around the third day," he said, "when you came out of the land office with your chin up and your jaw set and your eyes already on the next thing. I did not intend to, but I did." Emma Blackwell, who had kept her chin up through more than most people would ever know, felt her eyes go warm and bright in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. "The third day," she said. "Third day," he confirmed. "Give or take." "You waited 2 weeks," she said. "You fed me for 2 weeks and said nothing." "I didn't have any right to say anything," he said. "You were building something. I did not want to be in the way of that." "You are not in the way," she said. "You are part of it. I think you have been from the beginning." He reached out then very carefully and took her hand, just that. His hand around hers, warm and solid and exactly as steady as she had expected. She looked at their hands and then she looked up at him. "I love you," she said, because Emma Blackwell did not say things partially. If she was going to say it, she was going to say it all the way. His whole face changed with it. She had thought she knew his face by now, had catalogued most of its expressions through weeks of watching, but this one was new. Unguarded in a way she had never seen before, open and warm and a little undone, like a man who had been holding something carefully for a very long time and had just been told he could put it down. "I love you, Emma," he said. They stood like that for a long moment, holding hands in the boarding house parlor with the wind outside and the lamp burning low. Then he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, with such quiet reverence that she felt it down to her boots. Christmas came to Caldwell and brought snow with it, the first proper snow of the winter, and Jeremiah spent the holiday with Emma and Mrs. Calloway and the Hendersons, who had decided not to go to Colorado after all and had taken a small house on the edge of town instead. Mrs. Calloway made a roast goose and a tremendous amount of pie, and they sat around the big table in the dining room, and it was, Emma thought, the most like a family she had felt since she was very young. After dinner, Jeremiah sat beside her on the settee in the parlor, close enough that their shoulders touched, and Mrs. Calloway played the small, upright piano in the corner, carols and old songs, and Emma leaned slightly into Jeremiah's shoulder without thinking about it, and he put his arm around her without thinking about it either. And they stayed like that while the snow came down outside and the fire burned warm and steady. He asked her to marry him in January. He did it properly, came to the boarding house on a Tuesday evening, sat across from her in the parlor, and then got up from his chair and went down on one knee on the worn parlor rug, which she thought was very like him, that combination of old-fashioned decency and genuine feeling. He said, "I know you came to Caldwell to build a life on your own terms, and I want you to know that I think you are doing that with more skill and more grace than anyone I have ever known. I am not asking you to give any of that up. I am asking if you would be willing to build it alongside mine. You can keep your work. You can keep your independence. You can keep every part of yourself that you have spent your whole life protecting. I just want to be the person next to you while you do." Emma looked at him on one knee on that parlor rug, this man who had carried warm meals up a back staircase in the dark for 2 weeks without expecting a single thing in return, this man who talked about the land with passion and about injustice with directness and about her with a steadiness that had never wavered, and she thought that the most practical thing she had ever done might be this, saying yes. "Yes," she said. "Get up off that floor, Jeremiah." He got up laughing, and she was laughing too, and he kissed her, their first proper kiss, warm and certain and entirely right, and Mrs. Calloway appeared in the parlor doorway approximately 3 seconds later, which suggested she had been standing just outside it, and exclaimed and cried a little, and then went to make celebratory tea. They married in March of 1880, in the little church with the crooked steeple. The Reverend performed the ceremony on a bright cold morning that had the quality of the world beginning again, everything sharp and clean and smelling of possibility. Jeremiah wore a new suit that he had made in Wichita, which suited him well. Emma wore the dress she had made herself through the winter months, ivory wool with embroidery at the cuffs and collar, and when she walked down the short aisle toward him, she kept her eyes on his face and watched the moment when he saw her properly, the full impact of it. And something in his expression went very still and very warm at the same time, like sunlight on still water. "You are beautiful," he said quietly when she reached him, and she believed him because he said it the way he said everything, without embellishment and without reservation. The Reverend said the words. Jeremiah put on her finger a ring he had made from a piece of his mother's gold, simple and plain and more meaningful for it. They said the vows in clear voices, looking at each other, and Emma Blackwell became Emma Watkins in the crooked steepled church in Caldwell, Kansas, on a bright March morning in 1880, and felt no loss in the changing. They had a small celebration in Mrs. Calloway's dining room, because they were not people for extravagance, and because Mrs. Calloway had insisted. There was food and there was music, and there was dancing of a sort. Tommy the cowhand had gotten better at the fiddle over the winter, and played with more enthusiasm than precision, which suited the occasion perfectly. Harold Birch came with his wife and shook Jeremiah's hand vigorously, and told Emma she was indispensable to his books, which was the most romantic thing Harold Birch was capable of saying, and she appreciated it accordingly. The Hendersons danced together in the corner with the comfort of long habit. Mrs. Calloway cried again. And then, because they were practical people with a life to build, they got about building it. The house on the 30 acres east of town went up through the spring and into the summer of 1880, built by Jeremiah with help from a carpenter named Aldous who had come west from Ohio and was glad of the work. Emma was involved in every decision, the size of the windows, the placement of the kitchen so it faced east and caught the morning light, the width of the porch across the front. She had opinions and she stated them clearly, and Jeremiah incorporated them without making her feel as though she were overstepping, which was the most natural thing in the world to them both and would have looked, to anyone watching, like a partnership so practiced it seemed to have always existed. She kept her work in town through the building year. 3 days a week at the general store, the growing seamstress trade which she had begun to think of as something that might eventually become its own proper shop. She rode in with Jeremiah on the mornings he went to the store, and she rode home in the afternoons with the light golden on the grass, and it became one of the rhythms of her life that she loved best, those rides back to the land in the late afternoon, the house taking shape week by week, the barn going up in a single day with the help of the neighbors who came and worked and stayed for supper. The horses arrived in August. Jeremiah had found them through a rancher he knew, 2 mares and a gelding, good stock and well-tempered. He had a gift with them that she had been told about but not fully seen until now, watching him in the corral, the patience, the quiet authority, the way the animals seemed to settle in his presence as though they recognized something trustworthy in him. She stood at the fence and watched him work with the gelding one morning, a slow, patient series of movements that were not quite a dance but had something of one's intention about them. And she thought that this was what people looked like when they were doing the thing they were made for. "You should be training horses," she said to him one evening, "not shifting crates." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I am getting there." He gave notice at the general store in September, which Harold Birch accepted with reluctance and the warm acknowledgment that he had known it was coming. Jeremiah began taking in horses to train breaking and gentling and schooling. For ranchers within riding distance, who had heard through the network of word of mouth that operated across the territory that Watkins's horses came out the other end of the process calm and reliable and worth double what you had paid for them. Emma opened her seamstress shop in October of 1880, a year after she had arrived in Caldwell with 11 cents and a broken bag. It was a small room on the main street, next to the land office, with a hand-lettered sign in the window. Emma Watkins, fine sewing and alterations. She had the room set up precisely as she wanted it, the cutting table by the window for the light, the bolts of fabric on the shelves she had asked Jeremiah to build, the good pair of shears hanging from a hook by the door. The morning she opened, Mrs. Calloway came with a jar of preserves and a card, and Harold Birch sent his wife with a small bouquet of dried flowers, and 3 women who had been waiting for exactly this came in within the first hour with commissions in hand. By the end of the first week, Emma had more work than she could comfortably complete in the following month, and by the end of the first month she had hired a young woman named Clara, 16 years old, good with a needle, daughter of a homesteader family east of town, to come in 3 afternoons a week to help with the simpler work. Life on the 30 acres settled into a shape that felt, Emma thought, almost improbably good. Not easy, nothing worth having was easy, and they had hard days, hard weeks, the particular grind of making something from not much which required constant attention and effort. But it was good with the specific quality of things that have been earned. Their evenings were her favorite part of it. The day's work done, supper on the table, the particular peace of 2 people who were genuinely glad to be in the same room. He cooked often, he was, as the meals outside her door had indicated, a very good cook, and she had learned early to say so without embarrassment because it pleased him and because it was true. She cooked too, and they ate at the table in the kitchen by the light of the lamp, talking about the day or sitting comfortably without talking at all, and both were equally right. He had taken to reading aloud to her in the evenings, something she had not expected and had immediately loved, the way his low voice moved through a page of something, fiction or history, or the scientific periodicals that came in the mail from time to time. She would sew while he read, or sometimes just sit and listen with her eyes closed, and it was in those hours particularly that she felt the full weight of how different her life might have been, how close she had come, innocent Louis, to a version of things that would have left her with very little, and how she had walked 2 miles with a broken bag instead and arrived here, in this house, with this man's voice in the lamplight. Their son was born in July of 1881, on a hot, still afternoon when the prairie heat shimmered off the grass and the creek ran low and silver. Jeremiah had ridden for the doctor and then paced the front porch with a focused, contained anxiety that Mrs. Calloway, who had come out to help and had appointed herself in charge of proceedings, told him very firmly to redirect into being useful, so he was useful. He brought water and kept the fire going and was there when the doctor called him in at the last, and he was the one who held his son first, this small, red-faced, considerable-voiced person who had arrived with an opinion about the situation which he expressed loudly and at length. They named him Thomas, for no particular reason except that it suited him, and within a week it was clear that Thomas Watkins was going to suit himself about most things, which Emma thought was entirely appropriate given his parentage. She went back to the shop in September, taking Thomas with her in a basket that she set on the cutting table in the sun, and Clara took on more responsibility while Emma managed the work that required her particular skill. And the 3 of them, Emma and Clara and Thomas in his basket, occupied the shop on Main Street in a way that was much talked about and generally regarded with fondness. Because Caldwell was the kind of town where that sort of arrangement worked when the people in it were determined enough to make it work. Jeremiah's horse training had built, by the end of 1881, into something substantial enough that he had 2 regular hands helping him, and a waiting list of 3 months for anyone who wanted a horse taken on for training. He was out by the corral most mornings by the time the sun was properly up, and Emma would sometimes bring coffee out and stand at the fence while he worked, Thomas on her hip watching the horses with enormous solemn eyes, and she would think about the 30 acres and the creek and the map unrolled on the parlor table, and how she had been able to see the house even before it was built. She had been right. It was something. The second winter was colder than the first, and there was a stretch in January of 1882 when the snow was deep enough that they stayed close to home for 10 days, the 2 of them and Thomas, and the horses in the barn, and the fire burning against the cold. They played cards and Jeremiah read aloud, and Thomas, who was 7 months old and enormously engaged with the world, occupied himself with whatever came to hand. Emma thought those 10 snowbound days were among the best of her life, which surprised her, because she was not someone who had ever romanticized confinement. But it turned out that confinement with the right person in the right place was not confinement at all. Spring of 1882 brought a development she had not entirely anticipated, though in retrospect she should have the land next to theirs. The parcel that Cooper had been reluctant to sell came available when the man who had bought it gave up and went back east. Jeremiah came home one evening with the careful look he got when he was working something through and laying it out for her to consider, and he spread a map on the kitchen table and showed her. 20 more acres, he said, along the north side. It would give us access to the road directly without going around, and it would give us room for more pasture. Emma looked at the map. Can we manage it? Tightly, he said. For a year or 2, but yes. She thought about it for 24 hours, which was her way not to rush a decision that did not need rushing, but not to delay one that required making. Then she said yes, and they bought the 20 acres, and the land became 50 acres, and the shape of what they were building became larger and more solid. That summer they expanded the barn, and Jeremiah brought on a third hand, a quiet young man named Elias who had recently arrived in Caldwell from the south, and had an ease with horses that Jeremiah recognized and respected immediately. Elias stayed, and he was good, and eventually he became something more than a hand, a person they trusted, part of the place. Emma expanded the shop too, taking on the room adjacent and opening it as a proper dry goods and sewing supply, which she had noticed the town needed, and which, once opened, was needed even more urgently than she had estimated. She hired a second young woman, Rosie, who was efficient and direct and quickly became invaluable. The shop became something people drove in from the outlying farms and ranches to visit, not just for sewing supplies, but because it was, as Mrs. Calloway told her with great satisfaction, a proper establishment. In the autumn of 1882, Jeremiah came home from a trip to Wichita. He went 2 or 3 times a year now to look at stock, conduct business, visit the bank with a small flat box that he set on the kitchen table in front of her without saying anything. She opened it. Inside, on a piece of cloth, was a pair of sewing shears, very fine ones, the best she had ever seen, with handles worked in a small repeating pattern of leaves. She looked up at him. "I saw them in a cutlery shop in Wichita," he said. "I thought of you immediately." She picked them up. They were perfectly balanced, exactly right in her hand, in a way that the best tools always were, the way that told you they were made by someone who understood their purpose thoroughly. "These are extraordinary," she said. "You are extraordinary," he said, and sat down across from her at the kitchen table with his coffee, as though he had said something entirely ordinary and not the thing that went directly to the place in her that still, 4 years on, was not entirely used to being seen that way. She kept those shears on the hook by her cutting table and used them every day for the rest of her working life, and every time she did she felt the same thing, that specific quality of being known and thought of, which was what love looked like in practice. Their daughter arrived in April of 1883, with considerably more composure than Thomas had managed, and with a head of dark hair exactly like Jeremiah's. They named her Ruth, after Emma's mother, and Thomas was briefly uncertain about the new arrangement before deciding Ruth was interesting, and appointing himself her guardian in the particular imperious way of 2-year-olds who have decided something. Jeremiah, watching Thomas press his nose against the top of Ruth's head with careful gravity, said quietly, "Look at what we made." And Emma looked, and thought that there was no practical word adequate to the feeling, so she did not try to find one. The years moved forward in the way they do when the life is good, not slowly, not quickly, but with a kind of steady inevitability that felt, in retrospect, like arriving. Each season brought its own particular quality. The springs with the prairie grass coming up and the new foals in the paddock and the first ride out after the winter. Thomas on his pony Jeremiah had started him early, of course, with the same patience and quiet authority he used on all horses. And Thomas took to it the way he took to most things, which was with complete and immediate conviction. The summers with the garden along the creek, and the long evenings on the porch, and the heat that turned everything golden and still. The falls with the work of putting things up for winter, preserving and storing and tending, the particular satisfaction of preparing well. The winters with the fire and the reading and the closeness that cold air brought. They had their difficulties, as everyone did. There was a drought in 1885 that made the pasture poor and the creek narrow, and required them to buy feed for the horses through the worst months, which cut hard into the year's income. There was a dispute with a rancher named Holt, who tried to claim rights to the road that ran along the east edge of their property, a dispute that required a trip to Wichita and the engagement of a lawyer, and 3 months of considerable annoyance before it was resolved in their favor. There was a winter that was harder than most, when Ruth was sick for a long 2 weeks with a fever that required the doctor to come out from town twice, and that left Emma and Jeremiah both hollow-eyed and quiet until the fever finally broke and Ruth looked up at them from her pillow and asked in a small, exhausted voice if there was any soup. There was soup. There was always soup in that house, and it was always warm, and Emma thought every time she made it of a tin plate on a boarding house floor and the steam rising from it in the dark hallway. By 1886 the ranch, they called it the Watkins place, as these things are simply called, was established and known throughout the county. Jeremiah's horses went to ranchers from Kansas to Colorado, and his reputation had grown to the point where he was occasionally consulted on difficult animals by people who had heard of him through reputation alone and ridden half a day to find him. Emma's shop was the finest in the county, and she had a regular clientele from 3 towns over, women who made the journey specifically for her work and her fabrics. She had taken on a 3rd assistant and was teaching Clara, who had stayed and grown into a formidable seamstress in her own right enough of the business side of things that she could begin to work with some autonomy. Thomas was 5 now, brown and sturdy and entirely himself, with his father's steady eyes and his mother's quick mind, a combination that promised interesting decades to come. Ruth was 3, solemn and observant, with a particular interest in the horses that seemed to have come in with her at birth. She would spend long, quiet hours at the corral fence watching Jeremiah work, exactly as Emma had done in the early days, and Jeremiah had already begun her education on horseback with the same patient methodology that had produced Thomas's extraordinary ease in the saddle. On a September evening in 1886, Emma sat on the porch in the last of the light, watching the sun go down behind the western horizon in a long sweep of color. She could hear Thomas in the yard, talking to himself with the focused urgency of children conducting important private business. She could hear Ruth inside, asking Jeremiah something in her careful small voice and Jeremiah's low response. She could hear the horses in the paddock, the particular evening sounds of them settling. She sat in the chair that had been hers since the first summer, the one on the right side of the porch, closest to the steps, where she could see both the yard and the door, and she held her coffee cup and she let herself look at it. All of it. The land and the evening and the sounds of her life. Jeremiah came out through the door and sat in his chair beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and he looked out over the same view. Ruth had apparently been satisfied with his answer, because she did not follow him out but could be heard through the window engaged with something. "Thomas," Jeremiah called, not very loudly, because Thomas was in the yard and not far. "I'm here," Thomas called back, equally calm. "Good," said Jeremiah. The sun continued going down. Emma thought about Caldwell in the autumn of 1879, the stagecoach with the broken axle and the 2 miles on foot and the 11 cents. She thought about Mrs. Calloway's boarding house and the room with the window that looked out over the alley and the prairie beyond. She thought about the night she had come upstairs and found a tin plate covered with a cloth, steam curling up from the stew, and the feeling she had stood there in the hallway, equal parts grateful and uneasy and curious. She thought about the dark eyes in the poor hallway light and the hat held in 2 hands and the voice that said, "I saw your face when he said no." "Jeremiah," she said, "do you remember the first night, the first time you left the meal?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the darkening horizon. "I remember all of it," he said. "Were you frightened, leaving it there without knowing what I would think?" He considered the question. "Not frightened exactly," he said. "I did not think about it in terms of what you would think. I thought about whether you had eaten that day. That was the main consideration." She looked at him. He was looking at the sky, at the last band of orange above the western hills, and his profile was so familiar to her now, the strong jaw and the slight weathered lines around his eyes and the patience in the way he held himself, that she could have found it in complete darkness. "I love you," she said, the same way she had said it in the parlor 7 years ago, all the way without qualification. He turned to look at her, and there it was again, that expression she had first seen when she had said those words for the first time, that open, unguarded warmth, like a door swung wide. "I love you, Emma," he said, "every day more than the one before." Thomas appeared around the corner of the house, announced that a frog had appeared in the yard and required immediate attention, and was firmly told to let the frog conduct its own business and come sit on the porch, which he did, climbing up and inserting himself between the chairs with the casual authority of the very young. Ruth appeared in the doorway a moment later, decided the porch was the correct location, and climbed into Emma's lap with the particular boneless ease of a tired child who knows exactly where she belongs. They sat on the porch as the stars came out, one by one, over the Kansas prairie, and the cooling air came in from the west smelling of grass and distance, and the horses in the paddock were quiet, and Thomas fell asleep against Jeremiah's arm without meaning to, and Ruth was asleep in Emma's lap, and the night settled around the 4 of them on the porch of the house that had been built on a rise so the creek could be seen from the porch, which it could, catching the starlight in cold silver flashes. Emma held her sleeping daughter and felt the weight of her, this specific and irreplaceable person, and looked at Jeremiah holding their sleeping son with the same careful steadiness he applied to everything he loved, and she thought that it had all come from a covered tin plate in a hallway and a question asked in the dark. "I would like to know who you are." And the answer had been, "Jeremiah Watkins," and that had been the beginning of everything. She thought about the injustice in that territory, the things she had talked about with Jeremiah in those early parlor conversations, the way the land had been taken and the promises had been broken, and the people who had been here before all of them had been pushed and diminished, and her own quiet awareness that she too had known what it felt like to be considered less. She thought about how they tried to live in awareness of it, Jeremiah particularly, with that part of himself that his mother had passed to him like a quiet inheritance, the knowledge of what it cost to be looked through. They could not fix what the world had done, not 2 people on 50 acres in Kansas, but they could live with their eyes open and their door open, and their hands open when they could afford to open them, and she thought that was what they had been doing and would keep doing. The years ahead would bring more of the same that the years behind had brought more work and more seasons, and the children growing, Thomas into the serious, quiet young man that his father's eyes already suggested, and Ruth into whatever remarkable thing her solemn watchfulness was building toward. There would be more good years and hard ones, more mornings on horseback and evenings on the porch, more reading aloud by lamplight and suppers at the kitchen table, more of the thousand small acts of care that made a life together real and sustaining. And through all of it, Emma thought, the thing she would always come back to, the thing that was the foundation of all the rest, was those 2 weeks in that boarding house when she had gone to bed fed and warm and not alone, even though she had not known she was not alone. Even when she had thought she was entirely on her own, someone had been paying attention. Someone had seen her face when the answer was no and had decided, without making any particular production of it, to do something about it. That was who Jeremiah Watkins was. Not a man of grand gestures, well, not mostly, but a man of sustained, deliberate, faithful attention. The kind of man who noticed what was needed and provided it without ceremony. The kind of man whose love showed up every night in something warm and practical and left at the door without expectation. She had asked who he was, and he had told her his name, and she had said, "Come to the parlor if you want to talk like civilized people," and he had come, and they had talked, and it had turned into everything. Outside, the stars were fully out now, the whole great sweep of them that you could only see properly in a place like this, where there was no city glow to wash them out. The Milky Way ran in its slow arc overhead, and Emma looked up at it from the porch of her home on the 50 acres beside the creek, and she felt, with full and quiet certainty, that she had built the right life in the right place with the right person, and that it was going to be, for a very long time, exactly enough. "We should get them inside," Jeremiah said quietly, meaning the children. "We should," Emma agreed without moving. They sat a little longer under the stars, holding their sleeping children, in no particular hurry to end the evening. The prairie was dark and vast, and the creek caught the starlight, and the horses were settled, and the house stood solid at their backs. This house built on a rise to see the water from the porch, exactly as planned. Presently Jeremiah stood, lifting Thomas without waking him with the practiced ease of a father who had done this many times, and Emma lifted Ruth, and they carried the children inside and tucked them into their beds, and Ruth stirred briefly and said something indistinct that was probably about horses, and Thomas did not stir at all. They stood for a moment in the doorway between the 2 small rooms, looking at the children asleep in the lamplight, and Emma put her hand through Jeremiah's arm and leaned against his shoulder. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For every part of it," she said, "but especially for the beginning." He understood what she meant. She could see it in the warmth of his expression, the particular quality of being thoroughly known by the person who knew you best. "I would do it again," he said. Every night, she believed him. That was the thing about Jeremiah Watkins, the thing she had known in some essential way from the first time she had seen his face in that poorly lit hallway with his hat in his hands and the steady eyes. He meant exactly what he said. No more and no less. And that, in a world where meaning exactly what you said was rarer than gold, was worth more than almost anything she could name. She turned down the lamp in the children's room, and they walked together down the short hall to their own room, the room with the window that looked east so the morning light came in first thing. And outside the window the stars were still there, and the creek was still catching their light, and the prairie went on to the horizon in every direction, enormous and patient and full of everything that had ever happened and everything that was going to. Emma Watkins, who had arrived in Caldwell 7 years ago with 11 cents and a broken bag, and the kind of stubborn pride that kept people alive through things they were not supposed to survive, lay down in her own bed in her own home on her own land, and listened to her husband's breathing slow toward sleep beside her. And she thought that there was not a single thing she would change. Not one night of the hard years, Not one cold meal or empty pocket or proud silent hunger, because every one of those had been a step that led here, to this specific place and this specific life. The lamp went out. The house was quiet. The stars burned on overhead through the long fall night, as they had burned over the Kansas prairie long before anyone had built a town called Caldwell, and would burn long after, patient and brilliant, and absolutely indifferent to the small miraculous fact of two people finding each other in a boarding house hallway and deciding, against all practical odds, to stay.